Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and today I want to talk about how YouTube is disrupting television. The reason that I'm talking about this is because Shira Ovaid published a New York Times piece called YouTube is Underwhelming. And her argument is twofold. First, she points out that YouTube pulls in a lot less revenue than other platforms of its size. So it has about a little over 2 billion users. That's about the same number of users that Facebook has. And yet YouTube generates maybe half the revenue that Facebook does. So Facebook generates over $73 billion a year. YouTube is now at about 28 billion as of its most recent earnings report. So if you kind of take out Instagram and WhatsApp, probably Facebook is generating probably around 60 billion a year. So YouTube comes out to about half that amount. But she's also pointing out that per user, YouTube also just doesn't generate that much revenue. It generates less revenue than Twitter or even some major media companies like Viacom. And this is compounded by the fact that a lot of YouTube revenue is used to pay creators through its partnership program. Now, remember, a lot of YouTube is funded by pre-roll and mid-roll video ads. And with any creator who has over 1,000 subscribers, YouTube does a revenue share where about 55% of that revenue is going to the creator. So as a result, YouTube, even though it generates over 28 billion, it's actually only taking in about 11 billion of its own. So those two things together means that YouTube is nowhere near as profitable as other huge companies like Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat, which, while they do share some revenue with creators, for the most part, they're taking the majority of their revenue home. They get to keep most of it. Despite these things, I think she's wrong for two reasons. First, when you can't just compare it to YouTube to other major platforms that aren't as majority video based. You really got to compare it to other media companies that are video based. So when you do it on that metric, at $28 billion a year, YouTube is as large as Netflix, which is considered to be one of the most successful streaming video companies in the world. In fact, in terms of just streaming video, it is the most successful. But even if you compared it to other major media conglomerates, YouTube, using nothing but almost all user-generated content, generates more revenue, or at least on par in the amount of revenue it generates every other media company except for Disney. So it's just this incredibly, huge, powerful streaming video giant compared to its peers. But also, you really have to take into account how fast YouTube is growing. At the beginning of 2020, Google started in its earnings reports finally breaking out YouTube's revenue. And at that point, YouTube was a $15 billion a year revenue generator. And then as of its most recent earnings report, it's on par to bring out generate $28 billion within the next year. That means it doubled its revenue within the span of a little over a year. And from all intents and purposes, it seems like it's going to continue posting massive gains. So we're really only seeing it, even though it's a 15-year-old platform, we're really only seeing the beginning of its growth curve in terms of its revenue potential. And the reason for that, the thing to remember is that video is among the last of the mediums to get disrupted by the internet. You look at music, with the rise of Napster in the early 2000s, that just completely decimated the music industry. With newspapers and magazines, that disruption came in the late 2000s, right after the Great Recession. But for the most part, most major TV networks and movie studios continued to do fine for years after that. And the reason is because advertisers that advertise on television networks and stuff like that, they like the rich media media. They like the captive audience of TV. And up until recently, they've been reluctant to move their ad dollars online. But within the last few years, we've seen an acceleration of cord cutting, especially during the COVID pandemic, and we've been seeing advertisers get more comfortable in terms of buying pre-roll and mid-roll ads. And so we've seen a sudden gold rush of advertisers, those big Fortune 100 company advertisers that like to advertise on TV. Suddenly they're much more comfortable advertising online, and a bigger and bigger part of their ad budgets are going towards video streaming ads, the kinds of things that really thrive on YouTube. So that's why we've seen a huge increase in YouTube's revenue just in the last 2 years. And I think like one other thing worth noting is that one of YouTube's fastest growing watching segments is on connected TVs, things like the Amazon Fire or the Roku. And that means people are starting to use YouTube the same way that they're using Netflix or watching cable television. Instead of it being a passive consumption when people are on their phones or on their desktop, when they're just watching a little video in between work phone calls and stuff like that, they're starting to watch YouTube as a kind of lean back experience. And that's why YouTube videos, as you've probably noticed, are starting to get longer, stretching from 15 minutes to 30 minutes long, is because YouTube is incentivizing that kind of creating of that lean back experience, which is the kind of experience that advertisers covet, because they want to reach users or people who are watching TV with undivided attention. And that kind of couch TV viewing is the kind that YouTube can sell for much higher rates than it can if you're watching it on your phone or your desktop computer. In fact, it actually YouTube is now allowing advertisers to segment and reach those connected TV users specifically. So all these trends are accelerating in terms of revenue, in terms of cord cutting, and YouTube is going to be the main beneficiary of all that. And so I think it's very premature to say that YouTube is underwhelming, because it's really just getting started. Okay, that's all I wanted to talk about. Make sure to subscribe on whatever platform you're watching on this, or check out my newsletter. It's at simonowens.substack.com. Okay, see you next week.